My beloved child, someone needed to hear this today, and if these words have reached your eyes, do not scroll away. This is not a coincidence. There is something unfolding behind the scenes that your heart has sensed for a long time, even if your mind has struggled to understand it. Your soulmate has been carrying questions they could no longer ignore. They smiled in front of others, pretended everything was normal, and convinced themselves they had moved on, but every quiet night brought your name back into their thoughts. Every unanswered feeling became heavier. Every memory refused to disappear. Finally, they reached a point where wondering was more painful than knowing. That is why they made a decision they never imagined they would make. They hired someone to uncover the truth. Not because they hated you. Not because they wanted revenge. But because somewhere deep inside, they believed there was a missing piece of the story. They wanted answers. They wanted to know if the connection they felt was real or if their heart had deceived them all along. They expected facts. They expected evidence. They expected a simple explanation. But what they discovered was nothing like they imagined. The truth they uncovered did not make them angry. It made them break down. The walls they had spent so long building around their heart began to collapse one by one. The version of you they had created inside their mind was shattered by reality. They realized that many of the things they believed about you had never been true. They discovered sacrifices you made without asking for recognition. They learned about silent battles you fought while protecting everyone around you. They saw moments where you chose love instead of pride, even when no one was watching. And as every hidden detail came into the light, they found themselves overwhelmed by guilt, regret, and emotions they could no longer control. What they thought was distance was actually protection. What they thought was silence was actually pain. What they thought was rejection was actually fear. Suddenly, everything looked different. Every memory replayed itself with a completely new meaning. Every conversation they once misunderstood now sounded different inside their mind. Every goodbye felt unfinished. Every missed opportunity became another weight on their heart. They realized they had judged your actions without ever knowing the storms you were surviving. And in that moment, tears they had held back for so long finally began to fall. They understood that the greatest mystery was never who you were. The greatest mystery was why destiny kept bringing your souls back to each other, no matter how hard life tried to separate you. And now, something inside them has awakened that cannot be ignored anymore. This is only the beginning of a truth that is about to change both of your lives forever. The investigator believed the case was finished. Every document had been collected. Every conversation had been verified. Every timeline matched perfectly. There was nothing left to search for. But your soulmate could not walk away. They stared at the final report with trembling hands because something inside them refused to except that a stack of papers could explain a connection that had haunted their soul for so long. They began reading every page again, this time more slowly. Hidden between ordinary details were extraordinary moments they had completely overlooked. They discovered places where your path and theirs had crossed years before you officially met. They found dates that seemed impossible to ignore. On days when you were struggling in silence, your soulmate had unknowingly experienced the same heaviness. When you celebrated small victories alone, they had felt an unexplained sense of hope without understanding why. The deeper they looked, the more they realized your lives had been moving together long before either of you understood what destiny was preparing. Their heartbeat became louder with every page. They whispered your name, not out of curiosity anymore, but with a longing that had become impossible to hide. Then they reached a section of the report they almost skipped. It contained interviews with people who had known you during the hardest chapters of your life. One after another, those voices painted a picture completely different from the one they had believed. They heard about the nights you stayed awake worrying about others instead of yourself. They learned about opportunities you quietly gave up so someone else could have a better future. They discovered the pain you buried behind your smile so no one would carry your burdens. Suddenly, the image they had built of you collapsed. Every misunderstanding became a source of unbearable regret. Every assumption became another reason for tears. They placed the report on the table and covered their face with both hands because they could no longer stop crying. They realized they had spent so much time searching for proof about you that they had forgotten to trust the feeling God had already placed inside their heart. They remembered the first time your eyes met. They remembered the strange peace they felt even when nothing made sense. They remembered every moment they tried to convince themselves to forget you, only to find themselves thinking about you even more. Now they understood why. It was never obsession. It was never coincidence. It was a connection that refused to disappear because it had not reached its purpose yet. As the sun began to rise outside their window, they made a decision that frightened them more than anything before. They would stop hiding behind fear. They would stop believing the lies that had kept them away from you. They would search for one final truth, not through investigators, reports, or strangers, but by facing you directly. Little did they know that at almost the exact same moment, circumstances beyond both of your control had already begun moving into place. A meeting neither of you planned was quietly approaching, and when your eyes meet again, neither heart will ever be the same. Days passed, but peace never returned to your soulmate's heart. The report had answered every question they thought they wanted answered. Yet it had created 1,000 new ones they could not escape. They stopped pretending everything was normal. Friends noticed they were quieter than usual. Their family asked if something was wrong, but they simply smiled and said they were tired. The truth was far deeper than exhaustion. They were carrying the weight of realizing they had misunderstood one of the most important people destiny had ever placed in their life. Every night they found themselves opening old messages, reading conversations they had ignored before. This time they noticed the kindness hidden between your words. They noticed the concern they once dismissed. They noticed the moments when you reached out, not because you wanted something, but because you genuinely cared. Their heart tightened with every memory. They whispered to themselves, "How did I fail to see this?" That question echoed louder each day. Then something unexpected happened. While organizing the investigator's files one final time, a small envelope slipped from the folder onto the floor. It had been overlooked by everyone. Curious, your soulmate picked it up with trembling hands. Inside was a handwritten note from someone who had crossed paths with both of you years earlier. The words were simple, yet they carried incredible weight. The note explained that there had been a misunderstanding deliberately created by another person. Someone whose jealousy and fear had quietly manipulated situations, twisted conversations, and planted doubts that pushed the two of you apart. Suddenly everything made sense. Conversations that ended strangely. Silence that appeared without explanation. Moments when one of you believed the other no longer cared. None of it had happened naturally. Someone had been standing in the shadows, feeding confusion while pretending to be a friend. Your soulmate felt their knees weaken. Tears filled their eyes once again, not because they hated the person responsible, but because they realized how much precious time had been stolen from both of your lives. They looked toward the window as rain began falling outside, and for the first time, they prayed with complete honesty. They asked for one more chance. Not to erase the past, because they knew that was impossible, but to create a future built on truth instead of misunderstanding. At that exact moment, something stirred deep inside your own heart. You couldn't explain why, but you suddenly felt as if someone was thinking about you with overwhelming emotion. It was not imagination. It was not coincidence. Sometimes two souls connected by destiny can feel each other's turning points even across impossible distances. Neither of you could see it yet, but the invisible walls that had separated your paths for so long were beginning to crack. A message was about to be written. A decision was about to be made. And once those first words were finally spoken, the silence that had lasted for so long would never have the same power again. Your soulmate sat in silence for what felt like hours, staring at the blank screen of their phone. They typed your name more than once. They began writing a message, only to erase every word before it could be sent. What if it's too late, they whispered to themselves. What if I've already lost the one person I was always meant to find? Those questions echoed through every corner of their heart. They wanted to reach out, but fear had become the loudest voice in the room. Fear told them you would never forgive them. Fear reminded them of every missed opportunity, every unanswered moment, every painful goodbye. Yet no matter how hard they tried to listen to fear, another voice kept growing stronger. It was quieter, gentler, and impossible to ignore. It reminded them of the peace they only felt when they thought about you. It reminded them that real love does not disappear simply because life becomes complicated. They closed their eyes and remembered the first smile you ever gave them. It wasn't just a memory anymore. It felt like a promise waiting to be fulfilled. That night, they made another unexpected decision. Instead of asking the investigator another question, they asked for every photograph that had been collected during the search. The investigator hesitated before handing over the file. "There's nothing unusual in these," they said. "Just ordinary moments." But as your soulmate looked through each picture, they realized there was nothing ordinary about them. There you were, helping a stranger without expecting anything in return. There you were laughing with children, comforting someone who was grieving, standing alone after everyone else had gone home. None of those moments were meant to impress anyone. You didn't even know someone was watching. Those photographs revealed who you truly were when no one expected anything from you. Your soulmate could no longer stop the tears. They finally understood that character is revealed in private moments, not public ones. Everything they had searched for led to one undeniable truth. You had remained genuine even when life gave you every reason to become bitter. At that moment they realized they had spent so much energy searching for flaws that they almost missed the rare beauty of your heart. They held one photograph close to their chest and quietly whispered, "I'm sorry." It wasn't spoken for anyone else to hear. It was spoken because their soul could not carry the weight of regret any longer. Across the distance, you suddenly felt an unexplained sense of peace settle over your heart. The burden you had carried for so long became slightly lighter, though you couldn't explain why. It was as if an invisible chain connecting your souls had begun to heal. Neither of you knew that destiny was already arranging a meeting neither of you could predict. A familiar place, an unexpected moment, and a single conversation were about to change everything. But hidden from both of you, someone who had worked so hard to keep you apart had just discovered that your soulmate now knew the truth, and they were preparing one final desperate move before the two of you could find your way back to each other. The moment your soulmate uncovered the full truth, someone else felt the ground begin to disappear beneath their feet. The person who had hidden behind lies for so long suddenly realized that every secret they had protected was on the verge of being exposed. Panic replaced confidence. They began making frantic phone calls, deleting old messages, and trying to erase every trace of the deception they had created. But some truths cannot be buried forever. Some stories refuse to Stay hidden because destiny has a way of bringing light into even the darkest places. Your soulmate wasn't interested in revenge anymore. They no longer cared about proving anyone wrong. Their only concern was you. For the first time in a long time, they stopped asking who was responsible for the pain and started asking how they could heal the damage that had already been done. They returned to the investigator one last time, not to request more evidence, but to ask a single question. If you were me, what would you do now? The investigator remained silent for several seconds before answering quietly, I've worked on hundreds of cases, but I've never seen someone search this hard for a person they secretly stopped believing in. If your heart still points toward them after everything you've learned, don't waste another day. Some people spend their entire lives wishing they had one more chance. Those words stayed with your soulmate long after they walked away. On the drive home they replayed every memory again, but this time the pain was mixed with hope. They no longer saw a story that had ended. They saw one that had been interrupted. When they reached home, they opened a small box they hadn't touched in years. Inside were tiny reminders of you. A receipt from a place you once visited together. A note with your handwriting. A photograph they had promised themselves they would throw away but never could. They held each item as if time itself had stopped. Every object reminded them that despite all the distance, a part of their heart had never truly let you go. Tears quietly rolled down their face as they realized that love had survived even when trust had been shaken. At that exact moment, your phone lit up with an unknown notification. It wasn't from your soulmate. It wasn't from anyone you expected. Yet the message carried information that would unknowingly bring your paths closer together. You almost ignored it. You nearly placed the phone back down without reading it. But something inside urged you to open it. As your eyes moved across the words, a strange feeling settled over you. It felt as though an invisible door had just opened. Miles away, your soulmate had made the same decision at the very same time. No more waiting. No more fear. No more allowing yesterday's mistakes to steal tomorrow's possibilities. They picked up their phone, took a deep breath, and for the first time since the investigation began, they finally pressed the button they had been afraid to touch. The message was sent. There was no taking it back now. As those few simple words traveled toward you, neither of you realized that the next notification would become the beginning of a conversation powerful enough to rewrite everything you both believed was already lost. Your phone vibrated softly, almost quietly enough to be ignored. You looked at the screen without expecting anything unusual, but the moment your eyes landed on the sender's name, time seemed to stand still. Your heartbeat quickened. Your hands became still. For a few long seconds, you couldn't bring yourself to open the message. Somewhere else, Your soulmate was staring at their own phone, watching the tiny word that said, "Delivered." They had imagined this moment 1,000 different ways, but none of those imagined versions prepared them for the silence that followed. Every passing second felt like an hour. They questioned whether sending the message had been a mistake. They wondered if they had waited too long. They whispered a quiet prayer, hoping that if destiny had truly brought them this far, it would not let fear steal this final opportunity. Finally, you opened the message. It wasn't a long explanation. It wasn't a dramatic confession. It simply read, "I know the truth now. I'm sorry for believing what I never should have believed. If you're willing, I'd like one chance to tell you everything face to face." Those words carried more weight than 1,000 conversations. As you read them again, emotions you thought had disappeared began returning one by one. The hurt was still there. The unanswered questions were still there. But hidden beneath them was something else that had never completely faded: hope. You remembered all the nights you had asked yourself why everything had fallen apart so suddenly. You remembered blaming yourself for things you never understood. You remembered convincing yourself that perhaps some connections simply weren't meant to last. Yet now, with one honest message, the pieces of a much larger picture began falling into place. Across town, your soulmate couldn't sit still any longer. They walked from one room to another, replaying every possible outcome in their mind. Then, just as they were about to lose hope, their phone lit up. It was your reply. Their hands trembled so much they almost dropped the device before reading your words. You didn't promise forgiveness. You didn't pretend the past never happened. You simply wrote, "If the truth is finally ready to be spoken, then I'm ready to hear it." Tears immediately filled your soulmate's eyes. They smiled through those tears because, for the first time in what felt like forever, the door between your hearts was no longer completely closed. It had opened just enough for light to enter again. The meeting was arranged for the following evening at a quiet place that held memories for both of you. Neither of you slept much that night. You both wondered what would happen when your eyes met again after everything that had changed. Questions filled your minds, but one feeling stood above them all. Neither of you wanted another lie to stand between you ever again. As the next day slowly arrived, neither of you realized that someone had been watching these events unfold from a distance. The same person whose deception had separated your paths had discovered that the meeting was about to happen. Desperation turned into panic, and panic turned into a dangerous decision. If the truth came out completely, they knew they would lose everything. So before sunset, they made one final move to stop the reunion, unaware that destiny had already begun protecting a love that refused to be destroyed. As the sun began to sink below the horizon, your soulmate arrived at the meeting place much earlier than planned. They weren't early because they were impatient. They were early because they were afraid. Afraid that if they arrived 1 minute late, destiny might somehow change its mind. They stood quietly, looking around at the familiar surroundings, remembering the last time the two of you had been there together. Back then, neither of you realized how precious those ordinary moments would become. Every bench, every tree, every gentle breeze carried echoes of conversations that had never truly left their heart. Minutes felt like hours as they waited. Then, in the distance, they saw someone slowly walking toward them. Their heart instantly recognized you before their eyes fully could. Time seemed to slow. The world around them faded into silence. For a brief moment, it felt as though nothing else existed except the space between the two of you. You stopped only a few steps away. Neither of you spoke immediately. Words suddenly felt too small for everything that had happened. Your soulmate's eyes filled with tears they no longer tried to hide. They had imagined this reunion countless times, yet reality carried far more emotion than imagination ever could. Finally, they broke the silence. "I'm sorry," they whispered. "Not because I was forced to say it. Because I finally understand what my doubt cost both of us." You looked into their eyes, searching for the truth that had once been hidden behind confusion. This time there was no pride, no anger, no excuses. Only honesty. They told you everything. They explained the investigation, the lies they had believed, the report that shattered those lies, the people who had quietly manipulated the story, and the overwhelming regret that followed every discovery. They admitted every mistake, without asking you to erase the pain it caused. They accepted responsibility instead of searching for someone else to blame. As they spoke, you realized something had truly changed inside them. The person standing before you was no longer driven by suspicion. They had been humbled by truth. Before you could respond, a familiar voice suddenly interrupted the moment. The very person whose deception had created so much heartbreak stepped forward, believing they could still control the ending. They desperately tried to defend themselves, twisting facts one last time. But something unexpected happened. Before your soulmate could answer, another figure approached from behind. It was the private investigator. Without saying a word, they calmly handed over one final folder containing evidence that had only been verified that morning. Phone records, messages, witness statements, and documents removed every remaining doubt. Every lie collapsed in an instant. The person responsible stood speechless as the truth they had spent so long hiding finally came into the light. They slowly turned and walked away, knowing there was nothing left to say. A strange peace settled over the moment. It wasn't the excitement of winning. It was the quiet relief that comes when the weight of deception finally disappears. Your soulmate looked back at you, their voice shaking once more. I can't change yesterday. I can't give back the time we lost. But if there's even the smallest place left for me in your heart, I'll spend every tomorrow proving that I've learned what love truly means. You remained silent for a long moment before taking one small step closer. It wasn't a promise that everything would instantly be perfect. It wasn't forgetting the past. It was simply choosing to let truth have the final word instead of fear. In that single step, your soulmate felt hope return for the first time in years. Neither of you noticed that the sky above had begun filling with brilliant golden light, as if the universe itself had been waiting for this moment. What neither of you knew was that this reunion was only the beginning. The greatest surprise wasn't the investigation. It wasn't the hidden lies. It wasn't even the reunion itself. Waiting just beyond this moment was a revelation that would forever change the future of both your lives, proving that some souls are separated only long enough to discover the immeasurable value of finding each other again. The silence between you slowly transformed into something neither of you had felt in a very long time. It was no longer the silence of distance. It was the silence of healing. Your soulmate looked into your eyes and realized that the greatest discovery had never been hidden inside the investigator's files. It had been waiting inside the heart they almost walked away from. Every answer they had spent weeks searching for was standing right in front of them. They understood that love cannot be measured by rumors, assumptions, or someone else's version of the truth. Real love reveals itself through patience, sacrifice, forgiveness, and the courage to face reality even when it hurts. They reached into their pocket and quietly removed the final page of the investigator's report. For a moment they stared at it, remembering how desperately they had believed those pages would change everything. Then, with calm determination, they folded the paper one last time and placed it into a nearby trash bin. I don't need this anymore.